The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
Thank you very much, Dr. Roland Chia, for inviting me for this ETHOS seminar. I'm very delighted to be able to share some of the findings from the study. I really appreciate this opportunity to do that. Let me just make a couple of, some of you are just coming in, so let me just make a couple of broad comments so that you can understand where we're going and the length of this discussion. One, really you can read the 150-page report somewhere on the website. So if you get into the IPS website, you can download the whole paper. And that probably be better than what I'm going to be presenting, because I think it's clearer than what I'll try to ramble through. That's one. Two, you'll also be able to find some other pieces we have put on the same topic. In 2014, we put together a study on religiosity. It was based on a large survey that we did. We actually have redone that survey this year, so we'll probably be putting out some things in the month or so. It'll be quite interesting. So that one looks at religiosity, and so if you want to have a good sense of religiosity and people's practice, that might be quite an interesting place to be able to get some information on Singaporean religiosity. I also want to mention a publication that you can find on the website, not on the IPS website, but I think it's on Salt and Light website. It was done by Love Singapore. It was a survey of 2,000 Singaporeans, which looked at issues to do with aspects of faith and work. It's interesting, but it provides quite a bit of information in terms of Christian attitudes of a number of things. So if you are interested in some of the Christian attitudes, then religiosity and practice, that might be a useful report too to be able to refer to. It was very recent, it was 2017 research. All right, so let me look at this particular piece today, and I will endeavor to be as, I've got 45 minutes, but 45 minutes will be torture because you'll be seeing number after number. So, and I've not done any nice infographics and all that, it's just old tables, so just live with that. Hopefully we make some sense, and hopefully the Bishop Solomon and Dr. Ko will be able to make more sense of what I'm trying to share. Let me just preface this and make it very clear that this is not it was an IPS paper that we put out, but it was based on an international study. This is the International Social Survey Program on Religion, which is done by the University of Chicago. Chicago is actually a whole group of universities which work on an international study since 1991, and they've been getting notions of religious trends around the world. Singapore, they asked me to help out with this particular study, and so they sponsored data collection for the study, and so we analyzed it locally. So it follows the questions which are used internationally, and I think by July, the whole data set of Singapore and the many other countries, about 50 countries which are involved in this wave, will be up, and so it will be very interesting for those who like to look at how trends pan out in different countries. So this is the Singapore part of it. It was conducted. This study was conducted late last year, and it was done with rigorous methodology, so you can be quite sure that the results actually fit well with what the general population is like. And looking at some of the other studies we have done over the years, we're quite sure that the results are fairly robust. Today I'll try to cover a couple of things. One, I'll look at very quickly, try to take you through some ideas about religiosity, practice, and beliefs. We won't spend too long discussing this. Then we'll talk about confidence in religious and public institutions, attitudes towards religious harmony, religion's relevance, and probably spend the greater bulk talking about the role of religion and religious leaders and legislation and public policy. but I'll try to go through every section and try to point out some of the key trends. Just in case you're not familiar with it, but some of the data and some of the discussion has had some media coverage. It was covered quite substantially in the Straits Times and other newspapers. And I think Minister Shan used quite a bit of this study when he was discussing his ministerial statement recently. Let me start off with religiosity, religious beliefs, practice. If you look at Singapore, you'll notice that most Singaporeans actually view themselves at least as somewhat religious. In fact, 45% of people would actually say that they're somewhat religious, and the rest, about 17.6%, say they are very religious, and 2.6% say extremely religious. So if you look at a society, in fact, the great bulk of Singaporeans put themselves in a camp which is at least somewhat religious. Now, you'll notice that across the board, most people of every faith would rank themselves somewhere there. You don't have a lot of people who say that they're very religious. Among Christians, you actually have the larger proportion of them, between 3.3 and 3.8 says extremely religious. And of course, Muslims would feel the same way. But most people fall in the category of what most people call somewhat religious. Among Christians, there were more who would actually say that they are not just religious, but they're also spiritual. So if you notice, 55% of them would say they are religious and spiritual at the same time. About 41% say that I follow religion, but I'm not a spiritual person. In general, if you look at the Singapore population, there is substantial beliefs in the supernatural. So if you look at beliefs in life after death, beliefs in heaven, hell, across the board, people do have some kind of beliefs about the supernatural. In fact, if you look at those who are non-religion, or those who classify themselves as non-religious, you notice that a good number of them, probably about half of them, do subscribe to some kind of religious belief system. Either it's some notions about reincarnation, some notions about heaven and hell. So we do live in a population which does have a substantial interest in the religious, very broadly defined. In terms of the belief in God, which quite a large proportion of Singaporeans hold on to, you have about half the population who believe that God concerns himself with human beings, and about the same proportion have ways of connecting to God. Evidently, of course, most Christians, Catholics, and Muslims have a stronger view about a God who is known as being personal, and a God who concerns himself with people as individuals. You also note that Christians, Muslims, and Catholics, to a great extent, this is about like 70% or so, who believe that life is meaningful because God exists. We had a whole list of questions about how you derive meaning in life. Of course, people can find meaning in life in many ways. Most Singaporeans do have meaning in life. But among those who are religious, especially Christians, a substantial portion say it's meaningful because of the existence of God. So we had quite a few questions about the practice of religion, but I'm not going to go through tables of them, but I just want to make a couple of broad observations. Most respondents in our survey said that they were likely to pray regularly. Now, if you look at Hindus, Muslims, and Christians, they would be more likely to say that they at least pray once a day. In terms of activity, which was organized by places of worship, you do notice that Christians were most likely to be part of some kind of religious program. And of course, people have, divided in terms of the extent they practice their faith outside the place of worship. Among Christians, Muslims, and Catholics, they were more likely to do so. Some words about socialization of religion, which we also looked at in this study. We did look at the changes of religious patterns. A set of questions asked people about their parents' religion and what they were raised in terms of their faith. It was very clear, and this has been an observation since the 1990s, that there's a clear shift from Buddhism and Taoism to Christianity and to non-religiosity. And we also noticed that there were a substantial number of respondents who talked about a newfound commitment to faith. I'll just run through that. Just very simple facts that if you look at that chart, you'll notice that if you look at Taoists, for instance, most Taoists in the study would also say that their mother was Taoist. That's a little different from if you look at Christians, probably about half of them would not have the same religion as their parents. Most Christians and Catholics report some kind of turning point to their commitment in there. If you notice, about 76% talk about that. When we looked at across religious groups, whenever people say that they had some kind of turning point in their faith, they tended to have higher levels of religious practice, whether it's in terms of prayer or going to church or some kind of religious activity. Quick statement about attitudes towards morality. This is something, as part of the survey, we did ask people about their beliefs of various kinds of moral issues and, of course, gender issues as well. In general, the majority of our respondents adopt conservative morality. This is particularly the case among Christians, Muslims, and Hindus. Now, I have to make a caveat here. This study was done face-to-face, so the interviewer would interview the person and he would talk to the person face-to-face. That tends to, elicit a little higher proportion of those who would give socially desirable answers. You would want to contrast that with some of the other surveys we've done where people do it on their own, for instance, and they tend to be a little bit more frank. So you would have to accept the fact that people might, in the milieu that we live in Singapore is generally conservative, and there's a tendency to articulate more conservative views when you talk to someone. So if you say, do you support homosexuality, there might be a tendency for people to be a little bit more reserved about that when asked directly. So if you look at the figures here, when you ask, is this practice always wrong, almost always wrong, wrong only sometimes, not wrong at all, you notice that across the board, most Singaporeans veer towards what would be more conservative, especially when it comes to matters of sexuality. So sexual relations with someone other than your spouse is very, very clear, about 90% or so. Between two adults of the same sex, just homosexual relationships, you've got something like 70-something% would be in that category. Then when it comes to abortion, people may not be as conservative. It becomes a bit more liberal when it comes to that. If you look across religious or non-religious backgrounds, it's very, very clear that Singaporeans would be opposed to infidelity. So, having a relationship with someone other than your spouse, you notice that most people consider that as being wrong. But when it comes to matters of homosexuality, you notice a little bit more that it's among those who are Christian and Muslims, and to some extent Hindus, who are more likely to hold on to those views and feel that's a little bit more stronger. There's a very, very clear age differentiation that happens when it comes to opinion about homosexual relationships. Among those who are much younger, they're very clearly a lot more liberal about the matter. And you notice that in the 18 to 25 category, for instance, about 50% or so say homosexual relationships is not wrong or only wrong sometimes. If you break it down, if you look at the Christian population, which is about between 18 to about 30, about 30% of younger Christians would say that homosexuality is not wrong or only wrong sometimes. So you have a kind of a differentiation there compared to older Christians where, about like 7-8% would say that. All right, I've tried to cover very briefly some notions in terms of people's personal religiosity, whether it's in terms of their beliefs, their practice, how they identify themselves, and how some of this affects people's beliefs in morality. Let me move on to talk a little bit more about issues to do with religious institutions, state, religious harmony, and interreligious views. If you look at how people view various public institutions, Singaporeans in general have high confidence, great deal of confidence, sometimes even complete confidence in whether it's parliament or the courts and legal system. In fact, if you look at courts and legal system and school and education system, the great majority actually see it with great deal of complete confidence. When it comes to religion, you do notice that about nearly 50%, just under 50%, would actually say they have great confidence or complete confidence in religious organizations. If you break down, if you look at it from a religious point of view, I mean, among those who are Buddhist, Taoists, for instance, and those with no religion, they tend to have less confidence. But among Christians and Muslims, there's substantial confidence in religion and, religious institutions in general. In fact, if you, look at the figures carefully, in fact, among Roman Catholics and Muslims, they have greater confidence in religious institutions than in, for instance, Parliament. So there's substantial, confidence that people place in religious institutions. How about notions about religious harmony? In a place where people care about religion, how do you look at people who are of a different religious background? Over 70% believe that people of different religions can get along. So the question was asked, people belonging to different religions cannot get along? 70% actually oppose that statement. When we ask people in terms of their attitudes towards people of different religions, you notice that few have negative attitudes towards those of other faiths. However, quite a considerable number of Singaporeans, actually about a third of them, are actually fairly ambivalent. They were neither positive nor negative. From the broader views about religious harmony, that's not the best state to be in. Interestingly, we noticed that people who are more religious and who had higher trust for secular institutions tended to be less negative about other religious groups other than their own religious group. So religiosity seems to have a way of increasing people's trust to others, seemingly in the Singaporean context. If you look it down, if you break this down, if you look at, who is ambivalent, who views somebody of another religion in more negative light. So for instance, if you look at views towards Christians, right? Among those who have no religion, about 47% are ambivalent about Christians, and about just under 10% are somewhat negative or very negative. When it comes to Muslims, it continued. The figures are fairly similar. In fact, among those with no religion, considerable number, actually 56.1% actually say that they're neither positive nor negative. So they're quite ambivalent about Muslims, and about just over 10%, about 12%, say they're somewhat negative or very negative. The survey also phrased the question. It was about whether you feel threatened by people of another faith. And so, of course, you had different groups and people were asked, do you feel threatened by Buddhists or Taoists or Muslims? You do notice that about 10% of Buddhists and those with no religion find Christians threatening. Of course, what got a lot more attention was the fact that a considerable number of people find Muslims somewhat threatening compared to other groups. And so, if you look at the figure, it was about the figure that was printed in Straits Times was 15%. This figure removes those who are not Muslims, so it's slightly higher, it's about 17%. If you break it down even further, you notice that among Christians, Catholics, and those with no religion, quite a number actually see Muslims as somewhat threatening or very threatening. So, for instance, if you look at the number of Roman Catholics and Christians, about 21% or so actually feel that Muslims are somewhat or very threatening. Considering all the concerns about threat, the question that then was asked in terms of what people thought about religion. Was it a source of conflict? Are religious people intolerant? What you do notice is that most people don't strongly agree to any of those. But of course, quite a few people are ambivalent about that, and a number disagree. Another feature, and this goes with the broader discussions about religious harmony, has got to do with how permissive people are in terms of extremist speech. This is a very, very clear question which was asked of respondents. They were told about, to consider the case of religious extremists. These are people who believe that their faith is the only true one, and other religions considered as enemies. So it was very, very clearly framed. And so then the subsequent question was, should such extremists be allowed to hold public meetings to express their views? Most Singaporeans are quite clear about that. Probably not, or definitely not. That was what nearly 80% of our respondents said. Then, of course, they've also asked, should such extremists be allowed to publish their views on the internet or social media? And there you find a little reduction of that. So it's about 70%. So a little change from whether you can post something on media or something, whether you are allowed a platform. We noticed the younger respondents were generally a lot more open to religious extremists publishing their views. That's about 46% for those who were younger compared to those who were much older. Let me talk about some notions about religion and people's sense of its relevance and power. In terms of the place that religion has in society and how much exception or how much leeway religion should be given, a question was asked in terms of whether the government should interfere with the attempts of religion to spread. Most people were not in favor of government intervention in that matter. In fact, nearly about 70% or so would say that government should not interfere with religious attempts to spread. However, among those with no religion, you notice a smaller proportion, but significant, about 25%, about a quarter, who disagree with that statement. So the notion is that among those with no religion, there's a greater tendency to say that government should interfere with the spread of religion. Most people believe that religious organizations have sufficient power. Again, when we look at among those who are Christian and Catholic, about a quarter feel that religious organizations have too little or far too little power. In terms of the question about relevance of religion to society, what you notice is about 60% see religion as relevant today, and among those who are Christians, Catholics, and Muslims, a larger proportion believe that religion is relevant for the day. All right, let me move to what I consider probably the more important portion of this particular study, the whole idea about religion and its role in legislation and public policy. 3/4 of our respondents agree that laws should not be based on religion. So it's quite clear that people believe in a more secular way of understanding, or at least a way that religious precepts per se do not directly interfere with lawmaking. But when we break down and look at a question which was asked, and the question was, suppose that a new law is passed and that law contradicts with what you believe. Would you follow the law, or would you prefer to follow your religious principles? When that question was asked, you do notice that a substantial number of Muslims, Christians, and Catholics report that they will follow their religious principles where the law is in contradiction. This compares to, for instance, those who are Buddhists and Taoists and others. So among the monotheistic faiths, there's a stronger belief in terms of ensuring that religious principles are held above legal principles. In terms of how religious leaders should be involved in politics and elections for this matter, about 80% of Singaporeans are very clear that religious leaders should not be influencing the vote. But rather than suppose that there is a very strict notion about the separation of church and state, it seems that in Singapore's case, a considerable number do believe that it's all right for religious leaders to have close relationships with government officials. In fact, about 40-something% say that that's fine. However, most people find it unacceptable for religious leaders to remark to their followers about a politician's morals or their character. Also, most do not accept religious leaders openly challenging government law. In fact, very few people are open to that. So religious leaders openly calling on followers to treat government's laws as less important in a religion, in fact, less than 10% say that it's acceptable. However, on the other hand, when it came to another question where it says, a religious leader speaking up against potential changes to existing laws because they go against what his or her religion teaches is correct. You notice that more people found that acceptable. That's about 20-something%. And if you look at it more detailed by religion, you notice that among Christians and Roman Catholics, and to some extent Muslims, there's a larger proportion who would accept the fact that religious leaders to speak up when the laws are in conflict with religion. For the Christian case, it is nearly 45%. That said, there's considerable amount of consensus in terms of religious leaders affecting religious harmony in Singapore. So, very, very clearly, there's near universal type consensus here that religious leaders should not incite violence or hatred against other religions. It is not acceptable for religious leaders to make insensitive comments on another religion. It's also not acceptable for religious leaders to encourage their members to refrain from mixing with members of other religious groups. So in all these areas, you find near universal, complete consensus in Singapore that religious leaders should just not do this. There's a little bit more, latitude when it comes to other questions. So for instance, religious leaders encouraging followers to share their religion with strangers in public, you notice that it's a half and half, so about 47, 48% would say that it's all right, while the other, about 50% say it's not all right. For a question about religious leaders pointing out flaws in other religions to his congregants, even if done behind closed doors, only a small proportion, about 11% or 12% say that's acceptable. If you look at it, a little bit more closely, among Christians, Catholics, and Muslims, considerable number find it acceptable for their religious leaders to encourage public proselytization. So you notice about 70% of people would agree to that. Of course, you notice that those who are of no religious background tend to be more likely to oppose that. Also, you notice that about a quarter of Christians find it acceptable for religious leaders to privately point out flaws in other religions. So that's about 28%, substantially more than what you find in other religions. So more Christians are open to their religious leaders to do that. One of the projects, or one of the interests in this, and I'm coming to the end of my presentation, was to try to understand whether there was how do Singaporeans look at the role of religion and the role of the state, and how religion and state come together. Should religion and politics be separate? Should it be somewhat separate? Should it be completely separate? What we do notice is that the Singaporean notions of secularism are one that many Singaporeans accept, that there doesn't need to be a very, very strong, complete separation between religion and politics. So there's an understanding about closeness to religious leaders, for instance. There's an acceptance about some kind of communication between church and state. So it's a lot more amenable in Singapore than maybe if you look at countries like France. In the last few minutes, let me just mention this. This is a statistical kind of work that we try to do. We try to use all the data and try to think about various kinds of respondents. And this is what we call a cluster analysis. And we looked at various axes: religiosity, perceptions of other religious groups, moral liberalism, belief in separation of religion and politics, and confidence in state institutions. And based on some of that, some of the modeling that we did, we find 4 groups of respondents. And I'll just kind of explain what those 4 groups are. We've given them interesting names. The names which are some exercise in, I don't think it ever can properly explain this particular group, but each one of these groups have a name. So we call the first one Sacred Secular, second one Skeptic Scrappers, third one Tepid Traditionals, and the fourth one Friendly Faithfuls. It's a good test in alliteration. So we looked at them, and each one of them have some kind of fall in some kind of in some part of the spectrum on these different areas, whether it's religiosity, moral liberalism, perception of other religious groups, belief in separation of religion and politics, and confidence in state institutions. But let me just mention each one of these groups so it's clearer. So the notion of the sacred secular, basically these are those who are morally conservative and religious, but they desire more separation between religion and politics. And they're also open to people of other religions. We notice that this group was relatively middle class, and there's a disproportionately high number of Hindus in that particular group. So that's the first group, sacred secular. So morally conservative, religious, but very, very clear in terms of wanting state and religion to be as separate as possible. But at the same time, also quite open to people of other religions. So that's the first group. Then we have another group, which is called the Skeptic Scrappers. And this group has tended to be those who were the youngest, the most educated, and the most well-to-do cluster. And the large proportion of them had no religion. What we notice among this group is that they are less religious, morally liberal, and they desired some separation between religion and politics, but this group tended to be the one that was, of all the clusters, the most morally liberal. And as we opine in this particular group, it was the likelihood of emergence of potential tensions between this cluster and the more religiously vocal segments of society. Then you have the Tepid Traditionals. And these were the oldest respondents, or among, it was disproportionately more of the older respondents in this category, not as educated, not as well off, and higher proportion of Buddhist, Taoist, and Catholic respondents. This cluster tends to be a little bit more neutral on some things. The tendency is to be disinterested in the bigger issues of the public sphere, whether it's religious role in the politics or state institutions and all that. But they're more interested in what goes on in the private sphere. So in general, a little bit more conservative and displaying some form of religiosity. And finally, you have what we call the Friendly Faithfuls. We found quite a considerable number of Christians and Muslims in this particular category. Despite being the most religious cluster, there was also quite a few young people in this particular cluster. So there was the Skeptic Scrappers, which had quite a few young people, and the Friendly Faithfuls, which also had quite a few young people. And this is a cluster that desires the least amount of separation between religion and politics. But it's very interesting also that despite the strong religiosity in this group and the high beliefs in moral conservatism, this did not undermine their warmth towards people of other religions. In fact, they seemed to be the group which was the closest and most friendly to people of others. They tend to be the least who put the ambivalent option or the negative option. They tended to be quite positive of people of other faiths, so they were very, very friendly. Strong moral compass, had quite a bit of political awareness. They were very, very confident in state institutions, desired less separation of religion and politics, but of course, more of them would like to have a greater integration between state and religion. I've spent about 30 minutes now trying to flesh out a few details from the broader study we had. I know that I have not tried to make it in any coherent method, so you don't have the 5 main takeaways from this study. But hopefully what you have is kind of a very, very broad set of ideas in terms of where Singaporeans stand when it comes to religion. I start off by talking about the fact that many Singaporeans are actually religious. Many categorize themselves as somewhat religious. And even among those who categorize themselves as having no religion, they do have some kind of belief in the supernatural. In fact, quite a good proportion of them, maybe about just under half, would have that. So we do know that the religiosity in Singapore is quite high. People do have a sense of belief in something which is supernatural. We did also look at the fact that when it comes to how Singaporeans look at issues to do with the other group, the other, you've got a variety of opinion about this. But it's interesting that among those who are more religious, they tended to have a considerable amount, in fact, many more of them were quite positive of people who have other faith, and I think that's a good reality that we have in Singapore. Rather than being the group which is very opposed to the other, they tend to be quite open and in fact very warm towards those of other religious beliefs and faith. We also discussed notions in terms of the consensus that many Singaporeans have about the place that religion has within the broader public arena. Many Singaporeans tend to feel that religious leaders, for instance, should keep away from, for instance, the fray of politics. Did not feel that law should be pushed by religious groups, for instance. But at the same time, among the Christian population, we noticed that there's a proportion, not the largest, but certainly a proportion, who do feel that the religious leaders should play an active role in terms of not opposing, but rather to speak up about laws and regulations, especially when it comes in conflict with their faith. In fact, as I did mention just now, among Christians, Catholics and Muslims, very large proportion actually stand the idea that if their religious principles and the law is in contradiction, they would hold on to their religious beliefs. So from a broader perspective of looking at state-religion relations, you can see some places where potential tensions can erupt over time. You have a group, I just mentioned just now that if you break people into categories, you've got people who are like the Skeptic Scrappers, who for instance might be more liberal, who might have a stronger view about religion or not too keen about religion. And you've got similarly more young people who are very, very conservative, but also who are very, very strongly steadfast in their religious beliefs. One doesn't know what the future will be, whether these groups will be at loggerheads, and whether more and more contestation will happen because of divides that I mentioned just now. The very, very clear divides when it comes, for instance, in morality, one of it being issues to do with homosexuality. And it's very, very clear that it is the polarization is clearly based on age. It's also based on religion. And so one wonders whether when you have, those kind of differentiations and a growing proportion of those who feel strongly about religion and state being closely linked together, what that will pan out in terms of both interreligious relations and also religion-state relations. With all that, thank you very much for bearing with me for the last 40 minutes or so.